good afternoon, good morning, probably some places. Yeah. So we are now on our 11th session of these 5 fellow programs, and welcome all to this afternoon session. We had a wonderful morning session where Pratik Poddar from Nexus just took us through the term sheet. Now we will dig a little bit deeper into the term sheet fundamentals here. Yeah. Thanks to all as well who has participated in the assignment, pre-work assignment. I have gone through all of it, pretty interesting comments. I'm sure some of the comments have got clarified by now. Uh, and let's see if we can do more, and let's see how better we can clarify further comments here, right? With this, let me share my screen. So what I've done here is I've created slides for all the points that were there in the bugged term sheet. And we will just probably for the first 2 slides, we will just carry on with the theory part of the term sheet. And then I'll shift to the term sheet, buggy term sheet, and then we will flip back and forth between the slides and the term sheet to explain the terms better. Okay. So this is a typical funding process. This is the first slide. This is a typical funding process where, as you can see from the left-hand corner, the investors, the startups come and pitch to the investors. And if we are convinced, then the next step is the term sheet. And if you're not, obviously the investment gets dropped at there, right? So obviously we have already discussed this in our previous sessions, that how much percentage moves ahead and all. Now this term sheet is a very iterative negotiation process where you go on having the negotiations. It is concluded, no, we renegotiate the terms, and we again go back and forth, and then finally we conclude on the terms. We did that exercise in the morning. Now, if the provided after this the term sheet, we have concluded on the term sheet, then we will move forward towards the due diligence part and the SHA part, as you can see in the right hand corner. So this is a parallel process. Yeah. So the SHA and the SSA, the shareholder agreement, share subscription agreements, which we will keep on. We will engage with the legal team. The legal team will also do the legal due diligence of the company. There will be we'll engage with the finance firm, which will do the financial due diligence of the company. So along with so what we'll do is the due diligence report will come out. If you're okay with it, we will discuss it along with the SHA and the SSA. Considering that, okay, we are fine with the SHA and the SSA, and we are okay with it with all the terms, we will. So this is a kind of a loopy process, right? Go on happening till we all agree on the terms. If it is not, so then can the issues be fixed? Are the issues very, what is the lethality of the issues? If the issues are really lethal, then we will not do the deal and we'll drop the deal. And if it is still fixable, then we will go ahead and do the closure. So what can happen is even in the entire process of, the term sheet is concluded and everything, a deal can still get dropped because there are certain issues which can never be fixed. Moving on. So this is a typical, definition, or probably you'll get in every website. If you term what is a term sheet, we try to figure out what is a term sheet. So it is having the key terms and the conditions of a potential deal. Obviously, the term sheet is between the founders and the investors. There is obviously what happens here is the term sheet is a negotiation process where we are both trying to protect the. So we are trying to distribute the upside, the investors and the founders, and we try to protect the risk as well. I think this is what in the morning we were also discussing, where Swadesh was probably picked up a point where he mentioned that, whatever the term sheet deals are there, probably it will all depend on the negotiation part of it. Agree, but this is how we will try to negotiate terms out of it. Another one important point is a non-binding agreement. Obviously, just because you have a term sheet doesn't mean that the deal is going to flow through, as we saw in the previous slide. But of course, there are certain clauses of the term sheet which you cannot go out and start disclosing in the market, which is like a non-sharp or a confidentiality clause. And obviously, this also gives the roadmap for the lawyers to draft definitive agreements, the SHA and the SSA.
Samik, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Can you explain on the, what are the confidentiality clauses usually? Like, what do you mean by non-shop and confidentiality here?
Yes. So a term sheet is typically like an offer letter, right? So you get a job offer letter, then what you can do is go to another company and say, you know what, I have got an offer letter with me. What better offer can you give me? So it's like if a startup, we have given a startup a typical term sheet, then it's a more of a ethical thing that the startup, the founder of the startup should not move around with that term sheet with other venture capital and start negotiating offers. That's a non-shop clause. The other part is the confidentiality part, which means that, okay, there are certain confidential terms like the pricing, the valuation. All these are very confidential terms in a term sheet, right? Along with there are many other clauses as well. Well, it might be still okay that, okay, what is the round size to disclose with other investors? But if you go out in the market and what is the round size, but what is the valuation, what price, it is better not to disclose those kind of information. So obviously there are variants to it. If you are in a more advanced conversation with any other VC, then you would like to, then obviously you can start sharing. But if the round is not complete, probably, which was Shubham's term sheet was, where he out of a 2 million round, they were only willing to do 1.1 million. The founder has to go out and then say that, you know what, I have a 900K of scope of funding to be done, and okay, this will allow you around from 10% in the company. So obviously those will be there, but yes, this is what is meant by non-shop and confidential.
Got it. Thanks.
Right. Okay, so with this, I'll move to the buggy term sheet, which I have, which was created. So if you remember, there were two term sheets which were given, which were shared out, term sheet A and term sheet B. What I have done here is I have consolidated both the term sheets here with all the clauses, and I have highlighted the points which are not very good business practices. The ones which are in yellow pertain to term sheet A, and the one which are in green belong to term sheet B. Okay. So, and I'll also have, so I have received feedback from 3 of the groups. For term sheet A, I've received 1 from term sheet, and obviously, and GHGB will do it probably after this session. They will have a better understanding of the term sheet. So these are few of the, I have just consolidated them in all one Excel sheet for easy understanding. Okay. So let us see the first clause. Yeah. So the first area where I had a problem, where I had put a bug in it, is in the investment instruments and the price. Okay. Where it is in term sheet A, where I had put in the investment will be made through an optional convertible preference shares. Yeah. Now, well, nobody has picked this up in a way. If I have to say the investment, so in term sheet A, it was not picked up. So obviously, it is not a, as I said, it is not a very bad practice. It is not a very good practice to, we have discussed this in the morning, there's not very good practice to have some instruments which are not very standard in the market. But I'll just explain why this probably is not a very good idea to have optionally convertible preference shares. So this brings me to this instrument PPT, which obviously, as we know, that the promoters, the founders own equity or common shares, and the investors own the preferred shares, right? Either they invest through preferred shares or they invest through CCDs, right? Which we discussed in the morning. Preferred shares, as by its definition itself, there are various types of it. One is a convertible, the other is an optionally convertible, or a non-convertible, you can call it. This participating, non-participating, cumulative, non-cumulative. Participating and non-participating pertains to the fact of the participation in additional profits. Cumulative, non-cumulative is pertaining to the dividends. And convertible, non-convertible is, one is non-convertible. It also gives the feature of redemption to the preference shares. So what happens is, if I have an OCPS, if I have a optionally convertible preference share, what happens is this, the investor will have the right to redeem these shares out of the business of the company at any time they want, right? So this will put the company under a little bit of pressure. Because if the sometimes what happens is there can be many scenarios where if the company is doing well, okay, the company has enough cash to pay out this preference shares. But if the company is not doing well, obviously there's a huge cash burn on the company, and I'm not sure whether the company will be even able to meet this. So this is not a very good practice of having an optional convertible preference shares. Okay, so the best practice is to have a CCPS, or which is called a compulsory convertible preference shares. Okay. Any questions? Just to let me know. Does it make sense? Okay, good.
Samik,
Yeah.
sorry, just clarification on this. So option and compulsory, the only difference is that in compulsory I know when this can or cannot convert, but in optional I don't know. It can happen anytime. It can create some kind of pressure.
Correct.
Okay.
Just one of the features of preference shares, which is if it is a compulsory convert, if it's a converted preference shares, they have to convert. They have a maximum time limit 20 years to convert. Yeah, or before an IP, or unless some other triggers are there. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Now moving on to the next point.
Samik, the optional part, what are the clauses governing that? Like when can I convert? In other words, maybe you explained it and maybe I missed out. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. So when can you convert? Conversion is all completely dependent on the investor when he wants to convert. Yeah, there can be many events which they want to convert in. Probably, say there is an exit happening, when there's an IPO happening, but typically these shares have to be converted, and because they're going for a listing, right? So then they have to get converted, and then they can list the shares. Or when there is a so what will happen is, if I have an optional convertible shares and the next round is happening, yeah. So what I'll see as a next investor, as a second round investor, I'll see that my previous investor has got an extra right in a way that they can easily take the money out of the company. So I, as an investor in the second round, I'll always want my previous investor to convert back to a compulsory convertible preference shares, because these are not very good practices. So that way also the conversion can happen.
Okay.
So these are various scenarios where a conversion can, but this entire right remains with the investor when they want to convert it. Right?
A quick question on this itself. Is there any scenario where you've seen that an OCPS is actually used in early stage investing, or is it just not common?
Yes, I have seen. To be honest, it was quite surprising that we saw that the OCPS was used, and we also included clauses in our agreement so that when there's a conversion. So what happens in an OCPS is, in case of liquidation, what will happen? This will hold a little bit of a priority over the compulsory convertible preference shares in case of a liquidation event. When I say liquidation, yeah. So what they will get paid out, because they can redeem the money out, so they will get paid out earlier than a compulsory convertible preference share.
Okay.
Samik, the only benefit for the investor here is that he has a choice to convert or non-convert. Like, in case there's a lower round, he may not convert it also, right?
No,
is that why you opt for this?
No, so the conversion doesn't here. There is no what do you call the conversion? You have the holding percentage. So conversion will not change your holding percentage. So it doesn't depend on any round. So whether there's a lower round or a up round later on. So this is not.
Why would investor opt for something like this? Is what I'm trying to understand.
So it has got a higher liquidity preference. That in the class of preference shares as well, it will have a higher liquidity preference.
Got it.
And it gives the investor the right to take the money out, right? I mean, say what happens is, if one VC puts the money in the 5th year, and it is a 10-year VC, right? 10-year fund, sorry. So it has to get the money out it has to close the fund in the next 5 years. So, and probably it is not getting the desired exit. So it can use this clause to redeem the money out of the company and then can pay it to his investors, right?
They'll still depend on things like drag along, right? If it is there, then they can do it.
So drag is there. Yes, of course, drag is there, all these rights. But if it is not able to sell it to anybody else, right, then what can it do? It will try to redeem the money out, right? Drag is, I'll be dragging everyone out to sell their shares as well and sell it to any third party or anybody else. This is, I am taking the money out of the company.
I think we'll get to understand this when you also explain the participating, non-participating, and the difference between the two, right?
Yes, yes.
Sure.
I mean, there are more to come here. So going back to this, so liquidation preference. So in term sheet A, okay, thanks to Arun, he pointed out a little bit of a problem there. I probably, it was a typo. I, by mistake, wrote the company will hold 2x participating preference shares, but it should be the investor will hold 2x participating preference shares. Yeah. So obviously this is a bug, and mostly everyone has figured it out that, okay, 2x participating preference shares is a concern. Usually the norm in the market is around 1x participating preference shares. And in term sheet B, there was a cumulative dividend of 5%, and there were others. And I'll come to this point where over the holders of any other class of shares. So let me go back to my slides again. And I've just done a very simple diagram of how the liquidation waterfall will happen. Yeah, and which instruments are at what level and how will they get paid out in case of a liquidation. So if you see, so this you can also check from the, I mean, this is as per the Indian law. Obviously different laws, different countries' law will have different, I mean, what to say, categories that probably one is up to the other. But you can, if you want to check, you can check the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code, section 53, I think, and can see the kind of waterfall, liquidation waterfall that it has to follow. So if you see, the first one is, so out of the liquidation proceeds, the first one you have to pay is the liquidation cost. Then comes as secured creditors. Secured creditors means those who have got a right on your assets. Then you have got the wages and the unpaid dues, wages and unpaid dues of your employees. Yeah. Then you have got the unsecured creditors. Okay. Now unsecured creditors will also include your CCDs, your convertible notes and convertible debts. Then you have your government dues, whatever government dues are pending. Then you have your remaining debts. So just taking a step back in the government dues, if you can see, so the government is also a little bit more lenient here, considering that they want all the creditors, all the external parties, all the employees to be paid out first before they take their own dues. Yeah. Then come the remaining debts. Remaining debts can be anything, any petty debts or any related party debts which can come in here. But these are the very small part of it. Then comes the preference shares, and then comes the equity shares. Okay, so this is how the entire liquidation will go through. So coming back to the bugs, yeah, I'll come to this 2x participating preference. I have a separate slide on it. Now for this dividend part, 5% dividend, cumulative dividend. Obviously, as Pratik also mentioned in the morning, and it is also by law that all preference shares should have a certain dividend attached to it. Right. Now, by law, if it is, because it has been asked by law to have a certain dividend attached to it, so we usually put around 0.001 or 0.1% around that much of dividend. Because the idea of not putting a higher dividend percent, the investment idea is not to earn out of the dividend income. It is, the idea is to get an exit, a good exit, and then get a dividend, then get a good return out of that investment, right? And it doesn't, I mean, though you might negotiate a huge dividend percentage, say I want 10%, but ultimately if you do the math at the end of the day, you will see that it doesn't move your needle much as far as the return is concerned, as far as dividend is concerned. Because 10% on a 1 million, probably it will give you, say, probably it will give you what, 100K or something around that figure. And over a 10-year period, it might just give you around that much, which is not a very good figure to bargain for. But ultimately, it will just put a certain amount of cash flow burden on the company as well. And so either a dividend can be paid out, I'm sure most of you know that even a dividend can be paid out in cash, or it can be paid out in shares. Yeah. Now, if it is paid out in cash, then obviously it is a burden on the cash flow of the company, and many companies, these early stage startups, they don't want to incur this extra burden. Also, if it is paid out in shares, what will happen is it will invoke a lot of clauses like your anti-dilution, your and everything. A lot of clauses will happen. So ultimately, it is not a very good practice to have certain dividend element in it. So this is the idea behind dividend. Okay? As far as the next clause is concerned, if you see the green part, so this is with regard to. So if I go back to my liquidation waterfall, so there is a clause which talks about the liquidation preference for preference shares. So what is the clause talking is either so preference shares will have a higher right over the equity shares, right? And even within the same class, even within the same equity preference shares, you can have different liquidation preference, right? We spoke this in the morning, right? So obviously, there have been instances where we have seen that subsequent round investor will have a better liquidity preference than an investor who has come at the early rounds. Yeah, but going forward, I mean, what we are seeing is there's usually a practice that within preference shares there is a pari passu right, where all preference shareholders will have an equal liquidation rights. Okay, so if you ever see this kind of clauses, legally there is no problem in it, but obviously you have to think through that how will it work out for any investor who is coming in a subsequent round, right?
So, Samik, I had a question about the dividends. Like, how is it actually calculated? Is it at the discretion of the board, or like, is there a certain calculation for it?
So dividend is calculated on the amount of, so if you put 100K of money in and 5% dividend, so it will be 5% on 100K, which will give you $5,000 in a year. So either it can be paid out. So obviously the board will decide, okay, we are going to pay out a dividend, and then the dividend. There are a lot of formalities with regard to a dividend where your you have to decide that, okay, these many shareholders will get the dividend, this class of shareholders will get the dividend, and all of this will come through. As these are all because these are all privately held companies, there are not many clauses which govern the dividend payout. But obviously, there will be a board of. I mean, the board will take the call, and the dividend will pay out accordingly. Okay. So coming back to this liquidation preference, I think PLB, yes, they have said the same thing. Okay, I got the same almost from STM as well. I have not seen anything from TQV, or probably the similar. TQV, I was not able to copy the comments because they were not copyable. So I've just, wherever they are same, I've just kept it blank. Okay, moving forward. So this is also, I'm sure many of you know this. So this is the liquidation preference variance, where we have, we can have a non-participating or a capped participating liquidation preference, or a uncapped participating liquidation preference. Yeah, the legal terms are in the brackets below, where this is how probably they are represented in the term sheet, where it is a 1x non-participating. So there are two parts to this entire thing. The 1x pertains to the multiple on the principal money invested, and the next part is mostly related to the additional return on what is the amount, what is the participation that I can get in the remaining profits, remaining money. So that's how the entire thing is broken. So 1x non-participating, I'll only get 1x of my principal, and or usually the way it is structured is either is 1x of the principal or the pro rata share, whichever is higher. So that's how it gets concluded. Then there's a capped participating, which says 1x participating with 3x cap. Then there's an uncapped participating, which just gives 2x participating rights. So a typical example is below, where a 10 crore series A investment at 30 crore P money, and the company ends up selling at 100 crores. So I'm sure this is pretty simple. Where it's 1x non-participating, I will either get greater of 10 crore because I've put in 10 crores, or 25% of the 100 crore. Because if I put 10 crore in a 30 crore pre-money, I end up owning around 25% in the company. So either 25% of the 100 crores. So at the end, because it is a non-participating, I'll not get any additional participation. At the end, I end up with 25 crores. When it is a 1x participating with 3x cap, so I'll get principal return of 10 crores, which I've invested 10 crores, I'll get 10 crores. And the remaining, I have got 25% share, the remaining 90 crores or 25% 90 crores is around, I guess, 22.5 crores. So if I add 22.5 crores plus 10 crores, I end up with 32.5 crores. But I have a participation cap of 3x, which is like 30 crores. So I cannot exceed beyond 30 crores in here. So my additional participation will only be to the extent of 20 crores. And obviously for a 2x participating is, I'll get the principal 2x times and the additional participation of, so 25% of 80 crores and the 20 crores, I'll end up with 40 crores. Good, any questions here? Okay, so as we know, this is the best part of it. I mean, so we have all concluded that, okay, non-participating 1x, the non-participating is the best liquidation preference. So which is a good practice to follow. The board of directors, I think we have discussed this. So two person in the board of directors is quite high, considering the stage of the company is in. I mean, you don't want too many people on the board crowding the board. You want your best person to be there, best person from the investor side to be there. Also from the VC side, it is good that you will have an observer for any early stage, because what happens is as and when you progress for the subsequent rounds, and usually the board seat is given beyond a certain threshold of investment. And as and when you proceed to subsequent round, for the early stage investor, they cannot participate in all the subsequent rounds and they have to stop. They will dilute and will come below the threshold. Then having a board observer seat is very good in that point, because I have been part of the company when it was at a very nascent stage. Let me continue and as an observer in the board. By my shareholding, I won't be able to be in the board of directors, but let me be an observer, and as the money is also invested, there's a good, I can really monitor how the progress is for the company. So a board observer seat is also something you should also negotiate for, along with a board seat for an early stage, because this is the easy right to retain till a long time, the board observer part. So, okay, the board, I think everybody has given this almost a similar comments. So this is okay. So yeah, I think TQV has mentioned the minimum threshold for which a board seat to be kept and everything. Yeah, which is a good idea to have. When you have multiple investors, it is a good idea to have. Then moving ahead with the reserve matters. So reserve matters, obviously there were two parts to it. So if you see, there is a prior consent of the lead investor would be required for making decisions in respect of certain operational or strategic governance, investments and exit matters of the board. Now, there was a question asked in probably, I think it was asked by STM. So decisions to be run through the board or not. I mean, yes, it is not all the decisions, and it is not going to be, nobody is willing to micromanage. Nobody wants to micromanage every operation of the company. So what it means is any decision that the company takes, which has a certain impact, which is which is probably not in the business plan of the company, or which is not which has a huge impact on the cash flow or anything, those kind of decisions have to be, there needs to be a prior consent of the lead investor. Okay. Now I have marked here the operational part. I have highlighted the operational part. The reason being, see, if I have an investor who is more of a strategic in nature, I might be a little bit unwilling to give this operational right to that investor, right? Or compared to an investor who is probably more of who has invested the money to partner with me, or who understand the business and then want to walk along my journey. So to that VC, I'm more willing to give an operational right than to a strategic partner who is just putting in the money to understand, I mean, to have a strategic business synergies with me, right? Just for example, say Google puts money in me. I won't be very willing to give an operational right to Google, right? To I mean, to indulge themselves into my operational matters. So obviously, I'll probably give it to more of Pi, because Pi will understand my business and they will walk along with me and they will understand everything. They will guide me. So these are very subtle points that will be there in the term sheet, which you have to really be keep your eyes open and just like to figure it out. Okay, what are you giving away as rights? So the second part was, I think for the term sheet B, what I meant, I took out the lead part to it. So prior consent of the investors, I wrote. So it means that all the investors in the company will have the reserve matters. Obviously, you cannot give the right to all the investors. You just want to give the rights to certain few investors. So with this, I'll just come to this slide part of it here. So usually the affirmative rights or the board rights, there are, what are they? They can be broadly classified into economic rights or operational rights. And obviously these are, as we saw in the morning as well, I think Arushi's presentation had some rights in it. And so there were, in all fairness, because it is a common cohort, there was not many hard negotiations. So obviously, so these are a little bit hardly negotiated. A little bit of negotiations do happen on this. Then there are protective provisions. These are all protective provisions, right? I mean, I want to protect myself. I want to protect my economic rights. And I'll come to certain examples of what are economic rights and what are operational rights. And obviously, beyond I want to give this right to people who have certain shareholding percentage, and also I want to give rights to those people. I mean, they will probably indulge themselves into those matters which are beyond a certain threshold. So I am making a huge capital expense, or I'm making a huge OPEX expense. Yeah. So this is like a typical example, what can be of economic rights and what can be operational rights. So what do I mean by economic rights is that if these things are executed in the company, then I'll end up in, losing I'll dilute my shareholding percentage, or there's something will happen, my valuation will come down, or I might lose a board right. So all these things will happen, which are really, I need to ensure that these rights are kept, right? And obviously there are, so like a creation of more stock, there's a business pivot, right? There's an M&A, there's a issue of a senior rights stock, right? Then change of BOD compensation. So these are all where I need to really be involved in it. So, and in the operational rights, what happens is like appointment removal of auditors, incur an OPEX beyond a certain threshold, incur a CAPEX beyond a certain threshold, approve annual budgets, certain related party transactions, change in business projections. So these are typical operational rights. What usually is seen is in this economic rights, there are more, the VCs want 100% permissions, where the founder has to take permission from all the board members. In operational rights, it can be on the majority portion. Say if there are 4 board members, 4 investor directors in the board, so at least 2 or 3 of them gives the right to do certain operational activities, it can go ahead. But for economic rights, because each investor's position might get impacted, hence all investor directors would like to have this right with themselves. So you can, when you're forming your term sheet, you can easily separate these 2 rights and accordingly negotiate the terms with them, right? Just to add further, I mean, just because we have this voting where there's a 2 vote part to it. So this is in a preference shares, the way the thing is that preference shares will have voting rights when it is converted. So if you always see in legal terms, this clause is as if converted basis. So preference shares will have voting right. Yes, obviously, there can be, ideally it is to have one share, one vote. Two vote is not a very good practice. Yeah, but that's the purpose of it, that a preference shares will have voting right on an as if converted basis. That if it is converted to equity shares, what will be the voting for equity, and then how that will be the voting right equivalent to preference shares. So far, so good. The second point is the employee stock option pool. I think we have discussed it in stretch at length in the morning. So 25% is definitely a higher percentage. Usually 10 to 15% is what can be a good percent for an early stage company, and hence we will stick to that. Now, let me come to this transfer of shares. Obviously, I think, so the transfer of shares, the first point which was there was the investors will have the right to sell any part of the investor securities held by them in the company to any person. I think the only, as far as the assignment is concerned, so yeah, I think TQV got it right where they said not to any competitors. Yes, I understand. So there's an exclusion list which are created. This exclusion list is revisited at periodic intervals to see, okay, to whom we need not put the money in and everything. So then we should not be having, we should not have permitted transfers to those list of people. And there also I have added one part to it, that, okay, the right of first refusal is with the investor and the right of second refusal lies with the company. I mean, these are really hard clauses. I mean, if you want to keep it, you can keep it. If you don't want to, I mean, no need to keep it. Just remember, the ROFR rights is applicable to the founder shares, right? So if the founder wants to have a certain percentage of the shares being sold out, I mean, then they obviously have the investor to first convince, then obviously it goes back to the company. And so there will be I mean, it will be a difficult proposition for the founder. At times they would also want to get a certain liquidation in place. So in order to, make it a little bit founder friendly as well, if you see, there's been a certain carve out that has been mentioned. If you say around 1%, so 1% is typically a very lesser percent. Usually it is you can keep it to 5 to 10% range, depending on what stage of the company it is. So what will happen is, at least then the founder can have the right to sell its shares out to the extent of 5%. So if I keep it at 5% to anybody else without invoking a tag along right, that the investors will not also want to sell their shares along with the founder. By selling a 5% of the founder shares also doesn't change the control, right? The founder still has the skin in the game. So far, so good. Okay. Moving ahead. Okay, so these are some other rights. I think, so we have discussed this as well. So there are drag rights, there are preemptive pro rata rights, ROFR, ROFO, tag along or co-sell rights. So a drag right is where the investors can pull everyone in. So we have the drag rights discussed later. I'm just mentioning it here. I'll discuss at length when we come to the drag rights, right? And this ROFR rights and everything. So we understand this, right? What are the drag rights or what are the ROFR? If anybody wants a certain bit of explanation, I can just repeat. Okay, I'll come to this full vesting. The vesting of the founder shares. Right, so vesting of the founder shares is obviously term sheet A. It was full vesting at the closing date. I think everybody has commented correctly that full vesting, and we discussed in the morning as well. So the concepts are pretty clear. That okay, we can have a 4 years vesting with a 1 year cliff. Post the cliff, the shares are vested in periodic intervals. And obviously, depending on which round is it, if it's the second round, they have already had a vesting schedule in place and everything, or what stage of the company, how much the founders have spent time in the company. We can do a certain amount of pre-vesting part as well for this. Yeah. So this brings to, obviously, this is how a typical vesting will follow. If you see, if it is a 4 year curve with 1 year cliff, so from the closing date of the round till the cliff, there is nothing gets vested till the end of year 1, but 25% gets vested. And I have just given the percentage at each quarter. So it is a quarterly vesting schedule. At each quarter, the vesting is happening. Right? until by year 4, it is 100% vesting. So say a founder had 40% shares in the company as at the closing date with 0% vesting, right? This is the example here. So after 18 months, the founder will vest on 15% of his share. Will have 15% shares vested in his name, which is like 37.5% into 40%. Got it? Now here, one part probably everybody missed was that all shares will be vested at the time of exit, right? Now an exit can be various ways, right? If the person wants to leave, obviously, if the founder wants to leave, all shares cannot get vested, right, at the time of exit. Right? Then this is not a good clause, because I would want certain unvested shares to go back to the company, because if a founder is leaving, I would want somebody else to also take that position, take that responsibility and run the company along with me going forward. And for that, to incentivize that person, I would need a certain amount of shareholding, right, left with the company. So it should not be a good idea to, to vest all the shares of the founders at the time they're exiting.
I think at least for us, for our team, I think we understood the exit as a liquidation event of the company, not of the founder exit. So where generally all shares get vested.
Yes, Shubham, that is also in that case scenario as well. I mean, I've just covered it in the next slide. Hold on. Yeah. So I'll just talk about it. So what happens in this vesting of founder shares, and then we also, insist the companies to have a founders agreement in place, because these are early stage companies. Mostly they start the company, two founders start the company. They don't have an agreement in place between the two founders with the company. So we insist to have this agreement in place, which typically will have equity vesting, a founder lock-in, a non-compete, IP assignment, and exit term. These are the typical clauses of a founder's agreement. Why I'm explaining this to you, Shubham, and everyone, is I'll just come to what you just said at the time of exit. What are the various clauses that can get triggered? So yeah, so equity vesting, we all know, we just discussed. Founder lock-in is something that we obviously, because we have put in the money and it is a very it's a disruptive technology, say disruptive market, and we want the founder to be to have their part, have interest in the company. So we want the founder cannot sell their shares outside till a certain point in time. Though the shares will be vested in their name, but they cannot go out and try to sell their shares outside, right? So this clause, in order to transfer of shares, right? So we will put a lock-in into it, say that, just do not sell your shares outside at this point in time. Try to build the company.
Yeah, Samik, may I just come in? So this lock-in is becoming an important clause, and earlier I have seen in term sheets lock-in to be specified in terms of number of years, let's say 1 year or 4 year or 5 year, whatever. But of late, I'm seeing more and more that founder lock-in is almost to the extent till the investors is in the company. So founders cannot sell the shares till the investors are in the company. And reason is because sometimes what happens is founders get liquidity and investors are left holding the bucket. So that's why this lock-in period becomes important, and there are always carve-outs built in it, right? So if founder wants to sell 10% of his holding, that may be allowed, etc., etc.
So the non-compete clause, I think many of you have commented also non-compete clause also in the term sheet, where after the founder leaves, he cannot compete. He cannot join a competitor and compete with the same business that he was part of it. We had a 24 months clause that, okay, the founder cannot participate in it for 24 months. Somebody is more lenient, you can do it for 12 months, but it is good to have a certain non-compete clause in it. Then the IP assignment, this is very important.
Samik, sorry, I had a question on the non-compete. This is a topic of discussion that came when we were discussing it with the team.
Right.
So this non-compete clause is different for different countries, right? There's a part that is played by the government regulation as well. So for example, in North America, a non-compete will not hold, whereas in Europe, I think a minimum is 12 months. Is there an equivalent India?
I don't have the law behind it, that how much is it, but usually 24 months is...
No. I think there's some confusion going on. Every non-compete is a contractual agreement between the founders. So I don't think the country law, I could be wrong, but country law does not govern any statutory non-compete type.
I think non-compete on the employment agreement has a law, I believe. I don't know if non-compete on the founders agreement has,
I see.
because the founders will also have an employment agreement.
Yeah.
There is some non-compete mentioned.
I see.
So will this supersede that? Is probably this can supersede that.
I think we should check that if there is.
Yeah, I'll check this and get back. Thanks for this question, Arushi.
Thanks.
On the non-compete, there have been a couple of cases in the Indian startup ecosystem, also in the US, but because restricting ourselves to India, where founders have gone on to start a company in the same space. Couple of really big names come to my mind, and it's been pretty soon after they left their previous startup. Did they get the sign-offs from the previous venture? Did they give back? What's the protocol there then?
Yeah, it is. What happens is there are certain conditions, right? So suppose the founder is being let go, right?
Yeah.
In that case, you may have to relax the non-compete because you're firing a founder, right? Then it's not fair for the board to also not ask the founder to work on the similar thing, right? So there are these conditions can be built in, and therefore you could have a non-compete waived off in certain conditions, but it's always good to keep. The law part we will check.
So, okay, the IP assignment, I was on the IP assignment. So what happens is, because of all these early stages, when an IP is created, usually, and the IP is registered as well. So usually the founders will register the IP in their own name. Ideally, the IP should be registered in the name of the company, right? Because it is the company where everybody is trying to put the money in. And obviously we're trying to back the founders as well. So this IP assignment becomes a very important part, where all the IP has to now being transferred from the founders to the company. This is also becomes a very important part of the founders agreement. Just keep all these things in mind while creating a founders agreement. And obviously the exit terms. So what will happen if there's an exit for any of the founder? So these are some typical terms. So if there's a resignation, what will happen to the vested shares and what will happen to the unvested shares? So resignation remains, vested share remains with the founder, even in case of retirement as well, remains with the founder. Death or incapacitation remains with the founder, but obviously there is an accelerated vesting to the part of the unvested shares for the death and incapacitation. We tend to be a little bit lenient here because if there is something which has physical disability or anything, we tend to give a certain part of the unvested shares. We ask them to get it vested. But obviously, if there's a lever for cause, both vested and unvested gets lapsed. And if there's an M&A, which Shubham was mentioning, the vested shares obviously gets bought by the company, the acquirer, and the unvested shares depends on the acquisition terms. Yeah, so there's a lot of, so the other day, Manish was also having some inputs with regard to this. There are a lot of discussions that happens with regard to these acquisition terms. As you are aware, there's an accelerated vesting or a non-accelerated vesting can happen. Usually, at the time of forming this founders agreement, if we say that at the time of acquisition there will be an accelerated vesting, it might fall apart at the time of when there's an actual acquisition happening, because the incoming partner might not want might want that particular founder to stay along with that company and then continue. And if in case the entire vesting is done, then whether the founder has got enough interest in the company because it has been acquired and all. So there's a lot of questions then get asked. So it is better not to have an accelerated vesting clause, but if it happens, it is good, but it is better not to have an accelerated vesting clause at the initial part of it. So as you can see, there are various ways. I'm sure we have all read about it. The options of M&A, in case of accelerated vesting, in a single trigger can be there, a double trigger can be there. Where in a single trigger, if there's a merger, it can just accelerate. Or a double trigger is where there is a merger as well, and the company decides, okay, that I'm not going to take that person on board. So okay, then the accelerated vesting can trigger in.
So one thing I wanted to say is that even in ESOP, right? Accelerated vesting is generally avoidable. The reason is that accelerated vesting can fall apart on an M&A. M&A is totally dependent on the person acquiring the company, acquiring the company acquiring the startup, just to be very clear. And they may honor accelerated vesting or they may not. So it's better not to put it because it just sets wrong expectations.
Right. Good. Any questions here? Okay, so vesting, we are done. Moving on to the anti-dilution right. Everybody has got it. I mean, full ratchet is not a good practice. So I just have, so what is anti-dilution? Yes, I mean, it is a protective clause protecting the investors against a down round, right? So we already are aware that of anti-dilution, there are two big parts to it, two broad parts to it. One is the full ratchet, the other is a weighted average. Weighted average has a broad based and it has got a narrow based as well. Now, what is a broad based? Where all the it is a fully diluted shareholding. So it will have what is the current outstanding plus what is going to get converted at a later point in time. And for a narrow based, it is what is the current outstanding. That is the only difference between a broad based and narrow based. I'm sure you have seen this formula. This is a pretty straightforward formula. What I've done is I've done a very simple example here, but and I put only the solutions here, not the approach to the solution. Because the approach to the solution, if you are interested, I can definitely take you through the entire approach. It is a very it is a very iterative approach, and to reach at this position. So this anti-dilution example is typically, I mean, there's outstanding shares with the companies around 600,000 shares. A seed round is happening. Investor one puts it 400K for 40%. And a series A round is happening where investor two like to put in 500K for 50%. So if you do the math, you'll get a price of seed round of $1 and obviously series A, a subsequent round, a down round of 50.50. Now, if you see the output of this both calculation, full ratchet and weighted average. In fact, if you want to see the entire calculation and you want to do it yourself, the links are here. The full ratchet and the weighted average links are here. You can check it out. So if you want to see, so if you, at the end of it, what happens is, so investor one ends up holding around so initially they were holding around 400 shares, right? For 40%. At the end of it, because I have followed a full ratchet, in order to keep my 40% shareholding in the company, I'll end up probably around some 6 times more number of shares. And the price drops down to around $17p, right? Which was at $1, has dropped down to $17p. But I hold my shares, I hold my percentage, and I hold the value, right? This is what a full ratchet will do. And the entire dilution happens to the founders. The founders are 60%, they're diluted to 10%.
I think the value is maintained. Ownership might change. I think in this example, it's turning out to be the same because my overall valuation has dropped, right? But the value of my stocks have to remain the same after full ratchet. That's what I thought.
Yes, that's what. So, so I have now 24 lakh shares, 2.4 million shares of 400,000 valuation. That was my value. I put in this much money, right? Now the price becomes 0.17. For a weighted average, if you see, obviously what happens is both the founders, and it is a more founder-friendly approach, both the founder and the investor one dilutes, right? So the founder dilutes from 60% to 25%, and the investor one dilutes from 40% to 25%, right? And the price is a little bit much more better in here. It is around 0.69. So it is not bringing the price to 0.17.
By the way, I have seen examples of at least 2 companies in my past, startups who closed down because of they had a full ratchet. And in the next round, the cap table became untenable. And therefore, the new investor didn't put in the money. And the old investor won't give away the full ratchet, right? So I've seen at least 2 examples in which the company has died because of this clause. Yeah. It's a complete must not do. Just don't do full ratchet.
Right. I mean, yes. So as I said, if anybody wants to understand how this has gone from this to this, it's a huge calculation which I can take you through. Yes, I leave that to you to decide. After anti-dilution is the more favorable rights. I think we were discussing about this in the morning, but unfortunately, none of you have pointed it out. So it had a very lethal right, which was given here to the investors, existing investors. So it says that any terms, conditions, or rights offered to investor, which are more favorable than those offered to the third parties, it will shall remain with the investor. Okay. So obviously, this is not a very good practice that, okay, any favorable right which remains will remain, because then any subsequent round happens, then this right, you might have to then give this similar right to that person as well. And you might have it is a blocker in a way that for any subsequent investor to come in to say, you know what, you have given certain rights to that person, which I'll never be entitled to. So you just have to be careful about this more favorable rights. Right.
Manish, Samik, just on the last point and this point as well, usually when, let's say, it's a follow round with a startup which has raised some round already, do you go back to actually discuss these terms even before you discuss your terms with them, or how does that negotiation happen?
So
like, how do you know that they're on full ratchet? For example, they have an investor who's on full ratchet. When and how do you get to know about that?
So okay, so there are few conditions which there are 4 or 5 points which are always business discussions which will always happen, right, when our new deal is happening. Obviously, if there is a full ratchet, which is, I think it should be on the behalf of the founder to bring it up. Okay, you know that person is a full ratchet or anything, but mostly nobody will go to that detail. But once a term sheet is formed or anything, and we are discussing, or at the time of due diligence, we observe that there is a full ratchet given, then these things can really fall off and this get renegotiated at that point in time. Because at the time of this round, previous investor will also participate. They will also have to sign up and everything, and then they can agree to it or not agree to it. As has been mentioned in the first slide itself, right? If it is a negotiable, can it be fixed? No. Then we have to drop the deal. If it is a deal breaker.
Ankur, there are two elements which come into play. So when you are putting together a term sheet, the term sheet has to be reviewed by the existing investors and signed off. Right? So they will review it, and then if there is elements which conflict with the existing thing, then that typically gets brought up. In any case, after this, right, when you do the shareholder agreement and definitives, then the previous shareholder agreement is looked at to derive conditions out of that to put in there. So what will happen is a new shareholder agreement will actually override the previous shareholder agreement. So if the previous investor still wants the full ratchet, then he will say, his lawyer will say, no, put full ratchet in the SHA, right? Definitely. And then that disconnect will get caught in any way. But most lawyers review the previous agreements and then make sure that if the rights are getting withdrawn, then there is a discussion around it.
Got it. Understood.
Okay. So moving on to the exit and the drag rights, which are, I'll just cover them both together. I think, so we discussed this also in the morning, right? That, okay, how can we execute a drag 5 years from the closing? The investor shall have the right to compel some or all of the company shareholder. Now, remember, this term sheet and this 5 years is applicable only to this term sheet. What I mean by is, for the next round, this will again get readjusted by another 5 years. So it will be from that term sheet itself, from that round itself, that 5 years will be calculated. Okay. So if an exit is contemplated here, it will be from the last round the exit. Okay. 5 years from the last round. So what it is being said here, if the company is not able to raise any money for the next 5 years, then what will happen? Right. So this is how it should be read. And also it says, I'm talking about the drag here, and it also said, then if it is not able to raise any, then obviously the option is nothing but to the lead investor or the majority of the investors will decide let us sell the shares of all the company, and I'll pull all the shareholders to sell their shares. Whatever purchase price I'm getting. And in a way, to put a certain 3x threshold is also might not be a very good practice, because giving a threshold of 3x at any point in time, if the company, if the investors get a 3x exit, then it can just drag along other investors for the exit, is also not a very good right to have for the investors, right? Because I'm just getting 3x, I'll just pull along all the other investors. The other investors might not agree.
So
And
drag typically comes in picture in a bad scenario, typically, right? When a lot of time has passed, nothing is happening, and as an investor, you don't want any threshold on it. You should be able to drag the company to whatever price you want, ideally.
So hence,
what you just said, that is related to basically raising next round of funding, as Samik said, is one signal of how the company is doing. But is it common to attach it to other metrics of how the company is doing, and hence you have either continue to have faith or lost faith and you want to do get an exit?
No, it's not. So if the next round of funding comes together, then this timeline will again get reset, because in the new shareholder agreement, that timeline, the drag clause of that investor will come, right?
Yeah.
You have lost your previous drag anyway, right? So it's a new right.
Yeah.
So according to that, it will get covered. But let us say there is no new further investment, and this is the clause which is holding, and 5 years have passed. Then what do you do? Then it's a prerogative for investors to be able to drag the founders to get some exit out. By the way, it is easier said than done. A couple of my angel investments have gone through a lot of pain, where the company is sort of what we call as a land of living dead, right? It's not growing, it's not dying. And how do you get out, right? So you are stuck in that. So if the founder doesn't want to sell, it's very hard to generally to drag, because you also need a buyer at the end of the day, right? Somebody has to be willing to buy, then only you can drag this thing. But you still want to have a right, although practically very challenging to implement.
Right. Similar, I mean, the exit is also where, we mentioned that within 5 years, a typical range of 5 years has been kept to get a minimum return of 20%. I mean, you can argue why 20%, why not 15? That is a very aggressive thing to have, to keep 20% as the exit return percentage. But it is more with the idea that if you look at the clause and read it carefully, it says that the founder should make reasonable efforts to provide a full exit. So it is, even if there is no, I mean, the founder should make all the efforts, some good efforts to give an exit. It should not be lying on the, the founders are really reluctant to make an exit or anything. So this is a little bit of a clause which, I mean, you can argue or not argue, and adjustments can be made to this clause accordingly. Okay, fine. I think this is almost, we are there. I just want to cover the last bit of it, which is the convertible note. We have all this discussion that we had is mostly with the investment in the preference shares. So the convertible note, just to let you know that, okay, we know this, right? It just defers the valuation to the next round of financing. The key parameters are, I'll have a maximum valuation cap, or I'll have a discount, and I'll have a discount to it, and a lower cap to it as well. I fix the lower cap in a way that, because I cannot ascertain the valuation today. So, and I also don't want to convert my shares at a valuation which is so low. So I will fix a lower cap. So the valuation should be higher than this, and only then I'll convert. That's the idea of having a lower cap, right? Just to let you know, the convertible note there are three methods of conversion, and each one will give a different holding percentage after you do the conversion. And so the way you want to do or not do is all up to you. Usually the dollars invested method, as you can see at the bottom of it. So there are three methods. Let me explain the methods first, then I'll come which one's best. So this is the conversion method. There can be pre-money method, there's a percentage ownership method, and the dollars invested method. So in the pre-money valuation is fixed. That, okay, what will be my pre-money valuation? and accordingly the dilution happens. In the percentage ownership method, where the new investor is coming in, that person wants that if I am coming in at 40%, I'll hold 40% of the share, 40% of the company post the round. And in the dollars invested is, I'll have the post money is like, but pre-money was 8 million, say, I'm giving an example, pre-money is 8 million and a 2 million round. And so, and I have a 1 million of convertibles. So my post money will become 11 million. So 8 plus 2 plus 1 will become 11 million. And then my pre-money will become 11 minus 2, which is 9 million. And then we'll do the calculation according to it. So again, this is again a very detailed calculations are there, very detailed, very iterative calculations. And if you want, I can again take you through if you guys are interested. If anyone of you is interested, I can take you through. As you can see, the impact on the founders and the impact on the CCD investors and the impact on the venture capital who is putting in the money. You can see the dollars invested method gives almost everybody a similar kind of a dilution or similar kind of a, nobody is more diluted or less diluted. In the pre-money, the founder is best positioned where the dilution is the least, but the others are most diluted. In the percentage ownership, the founders are the worst position, and the CCD and the VCs are the best positions in it. And the dollars invested is this. So this will again depend on your negotiation, what will happen, that okay, which one do you want to follow? And then accordingly, you can take a call as to what will be the position that you want to take. Just few more terms, just for the purpose of concluding this and touch upon the topics. Valuation, we know what is valuation, post-money valuation. Tranching, Manish mentioned this in the morning, what is tranching? ESOP, we have discussed. The clawback is a typical term which is not seen very much these days, but there is still, I'm just touching on the topic where, you know, the chance to reclaim money or stock are already given to a founder or an employee, where you can, if they have not performed or if there is some legal case or some thing which has been against those founders or companies, then we can claw back certain amount of shares. And obviously the legal and the due diligence fees, whatever we do, this is also part of the entire term sheet where we mentioned that this will definitely be borne by the company where we're putting the money. And yeah, so that's what it is. And we can negotiate okay, how much will be the fees. That's what it is. Right. I think, and yes, the validity, I mentioned that it is 1 year from the execution unless extended by parties. Yes, it cannot be 1 year. Usually it is between 60 to 90 days that we usually keep it. Similarly for the exclusivity as well, I think some questions were there on the exclusivity part, which should also be within that range itself. I think with this, we can conclude this term session. If you have any questions, happy to take them now.
Yeah, Samik, I just wanted to ask a quick question on the vesting part. Like, in case the founder is fired, what happened? What happens in that case?
Yes. So if it is fired, so it can be a case of resignation or retirement, whichever way you want to treat it. Now, there can be firing can be because of two reasons, right? It can be for a cause or for a non-cause activity. If a non-cause happens, the first three scenarios can be looked into. If for a cause happens, the vested shares lapse and the unvested also lapse.
This is totally to your design. The founders agreement will govern what it is, and the shareholder agreement will also have a mention of this.
So when the vested shares remain with the founder, then what happens in that case? Like whenever liquidity event happens, then he gets the.
Yeah, either that or you do a deal on secondary or something like that. Try to clean up the cap table before. But yes, it's with the founders.
In the same slide, the M&A part, what happens to the unvested shares? The company which is acquiring, does it have to pay any value for it because it remains with the company, right?
Yeah, that's what. So it is totally dependent on the terms of the acquisition. So in certain cases, unvested shares are converted into shares of the company. In certain cases, cash. I don't know. I think in one case, sometimes they're cancelled also, but I'm just trying to recall whether I have seen that. So it totally depends upon the terms of merger.
Okay.
In the instrument, right, the investment instrument, I think the term sheet B mentioned about preference shares and the equity shares
Right.
being used. I have seen a combination of the two, but trying to understand from the VC point of view, obviously preferred shares are better, but is it more of a negotiation? Is it more of making it sweeter for the founders? What is the thought, and what are the typical split ratios which are?
There is no business call in it. It is purely
Hmm.
from legal perspective. Just to
Oh,
yeah. So
okay.
and it was from a legal perspective. Let me put it this way. So in this Companies Act 2013, the last
Hmm.
amendment to the Companies Act. So what they said is the voting can only remain with the equity shares and not with the preference shares holders.
Okay.
So what happened is, so what we do is in our deals, but it has been amended subsequently, and now it has been rectified where the preference shares will also have voting right as on an as if converted basis. So what happens is we have a very nominal holding in equity shares, probably 5 shares or 10 shares, and everything else goes to the preference shares.
Okay. Got it.
That's the entire reason.
It was a workaround for the bug in Companies Act.
Samik, in case of the death and disability, we are actually discussing that within our group also. You said what typically happens since it remains with the, I mean, the vested shares remain with the founder, but if the founder is dead, then where does it go?
Yeah, if the founder is dead, obviously there are nominations which happen.
Okay.
Immediate family members will get nominated to that, or whosoever the founder wants to nominate. And it can be a little bit harsh where the unvested shares, you can say that, okay, only 50% of the unvested shares get vested, or you can be lenient and say all 100% of the unvested shares can be vested. It all depends on you.
Yeah. So the thought that came to our head also was that it will go to a nominee because that's how typically all these instruments
Yes,
work.
yes, that's what.
But in case of a startup, don't you think, I mean, would you want a stranger on your cap table sort of thing? I know it's harsh. This whole topic is very morbid, but how do startups usually do this? Because you don't want a nominee on your cap table, right? Because that person may not have anything to do with the business.
True, but I mean, the founder has, if you look at from the founder's perspective, so the founder has already, okay, there are two options, right? Either I can buy back those shares and give the money back to the nominee that, you keep it and the company has it. And later on, we can again issue those shares to someone else who is capable of doing the job. Or I mean, if I look at from the founder's perspective, the founder had probably put in a lot of effort in running this company and setting up the business. And at some point in time, probably because of a mishap, it has happened. It is unfair to to take away the shares, right?
Yeah, of course, of course. I'm not debating the fairness at all. It would be extremely unfair. But how do startups deal with it? Is my question.
Give the rights on those shares. They're only of commercial value. They'll stay on the cap.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, on that front, I think what Netherlands has, so in Netherlands, issuing stock options is very cumbersome and tax inefficient.
I see.
So you have these things called certificates, which give the employees all the economic rights, but they don't get any voting rights or any other rights, which normally like a voting share would, like a share would give you. So at the time of liquidation or something, you just get the economic rights associated with that paper, but no other rights. So I think I'm guessing this would you would do the same in terms of if someone passed away. And
Right, absolutely.
I had a question about do you see these terms being more skewed towards the VC in the case where there's a lot of proprietary deal flow? For example, say an accelerator or those kind of scenarios where the startup is sort of more dependent on getting funded through that particular institution itself.
It's a business call. Typically, the earlier you are, the more standard your term sheet is actually, right? So for example, EF will have same terms for everyone. We also have same terms for everyone. We only change 1 or 2, 3 to 4 things right in the term sheet. You could, I mean, few years back when the supply of capital was less, you could twist the arm and do it in your favor, but it doesn't really work in the long run. Because then as system starts to mature, you don't get the right deals because people will be wary of you making deals with you because you're not offering the right terms.
Yeah.
I mean, it
I
is
guess
all.
sign of the ecosystem maturing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it is part of the negotiation, right? I mean, say probably one point that I might have missed out in the liquidation preference. Somebody might, negotiate the valuation of the company with a better liquidation preference, right? Then you might want to say, okay, 1x non-participating is not there. You might want to do it with a uncapped participating liquidation preference. Right? So it all depends. Say you want to raise money and not getting any investors for it, and you get one investor, then what happens? Whose position you are in?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can wind up the session and then just do an open Q&A and close today. We can get some time back for the cohort session is smaller. You can stop sharing, Samit.
Yep, sure. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Samik.
Thanks, Alec.
thanks, Amit.